Hi, everybody. Brad Truax here from Eastman's Woodlands and Wildlife Committee. And today we're going to talk about porcupines. There's beautiful porcupine feasting on some vegetation. The porcupine is the second largest rodent in North America. Of course, the beaver is the biggest. Porcupines can weigh up to about 35 pounds, but most weigh a little bit less than 20 pounds. They have over 40,000 quills. The quills are made of keratin. They're each 1 to 4 inches long, and they're the main way that they protect themselves from predators. The quills detach very easily when they're touched, and porcupines can't shoot their quills, but don't tell that to a dog that's been quilled. Rather, what happens is they flex their muscles on their back, and that raises the quills, and then they slap them at the animal or the human that gets too close to them. They can also swing that muscular tail like a mace, and they also emit a pungent odor that they can use as a defensive tool. They're very slow moving and clumsy when they're on land, but they're excellent climbers and they're excellent swimmers. They are nearsighted, but they have a very strong sense of smell. So again, they're strict herbivores. They're particularly fond of hemlock branches and needles. And they have very short legs and they're very slow, clumsy waddlers when they're on land. But as mentioned before, they're very adept at climbing trees, and they can also swim. And all those sharp quills serve as defense against the predators. So here's what a quill looks like up close. The quills are made of keratin. Keratin is the same substance your fingernails are made of. And these quills function similar to fish hooks. They're made of tiny overlapping scales, and they have these little tiny backward pointing barbs. If you look very closely here, you see a backward pointing barb. And those features make it very hard to pull a quill out from the skin once the quill has entered the skin of a predator. So what happens after a porcupine slaps its quills at a dog or other animal? Well, the quills will grow back eventually. They usually grow back at about 1 millimeter every 2 days. And porcupines also shed their quills periodically. And new ones begin developing usually within a few days after the old ones have been shed or removed. And by the way, those quills are also filled with air, which helps make the porcupine quite buoyant when they're in water. Here's a very rare albino porcupine. It's estimated that only one in every 10,000 porcupines is an albino, but several have actually been spotted in New Hampshire recently. Note the pink eyes, okay, as well as the white color. And the white color actually would make this porcupine much more vulnerable to predators. And albino wildlife in general also tend to have more health problems than non-albino wildlife. So again, you're actually pretty lucky to see a porcupine. That's because they're very shy and they're also primarily nocturnal. They spend much of their time in trees or in their dens, and you're actually much more likely to see them as roadkill, unfortunately. But if you're walking in the woods, don't forget to look up because they might be up in a tree. How many of you would have actually spotted this porcupine in this picture? Okay, so if we seldom see them, how do we know they're out there? Well, mainly by the signs and the clues that they leave. And some of those clues are large scat piles that they leave outside a den, hemlock twigs on the ground. I mentioned that hemlocks are one of their favorite foods. Bark removed from trees. We'll show you some pictures of that. And characteristic tracks and track patterns. Okay, so the porcupine reproduction. The porcupine is fertile just once a year and only for a period of 8 to 12 hours. That has to be some sort of record for wildlife being fertile. Porcupines usually don't make much sound, but when they're mating, they apparently whine, moan, grunt, click their teeth, wail, shriek, and scream. So they're quite noisy when they are mating. The gestation period averages 210 days, and they usually have a single offspring that's called a porcupet. The porcupet's usually delivered in spring, and the porcupets are born with soft quills, but usually within a few days, those quills begin to harden. And by late fall, those porcupets are off on their own. Um, we've never heard porcupines vocalizing. but that's probably because we seldom see them. The people who work with them, such as people in zoos or biologists who are studying the porcupines, describe them as incredibly vocal animals. And they can apparently cough, shriek, whistle like a bird, make funny kazoo-like noises, chatter their teeth, and grunt. So what do porcupines eat? Well, they're herbivores. They eat needles and bark from evergreen trees in winter. Other times a year, they may eat some berries, seeds, grasses, flowers, leaves, and they'll even swim into ponds to eat the water lilies. In the fall, they prefer acorns, hickory nuts, and beech nuts. And hemlock buds and branches are real favorites of the porcupines almost any time of year. And they'll often remove the outer bark of trees in order to get at the more nutritious underlying soft bark. They often gnaw on bones or antlers to get the calcium and mineral content that they can't otherwise get. And sometimes they've been known to chew on the wooden axe handles or canoe paddles on somebody's property. And they love eating plywood for some reason. Okay, well, how do they digest those buds, branches, and bark? They don't have the multi-chambered stomachs like deer have to help digest the cellulose. But those high fiber foods tend to sit in their large cecum for long periods of time, almost up to 40 hours. And that helps them slowly digest what they've eaten. And it allows more time for microorganisms and enzymes to actually break down that cellulose. So porcupines really crave salt. That's probably why we often see them at roadsides where they can feed on some of the road salt. And it's probably also why they chew on those wooden axe handles or canoe paddles, because there's some salt there from human sweat on those axe handles and canoe paddles. Okay, here's a porcupine gnawing on a tree. Trees are their prime source of food in the wintertime, and they often remove the outer bark so that they can get at the more nutritious underlying soft bark. And hemlocks and other evergreens are really their favorites. Here's a couple porcupines that are out on a branch high in this tree. It's a hemlock, again, one of their prime sources of food in the winter. And here's one that's probably getting down a little bit too far. He's approaching what we would call the danger zone. Porcupines are known for climbing out too far on the branches, falling to the ground, and actually getting injured. Okay, how long does a porcupine live? Well, the average lifespan of a porcupine is 5 to 7 years. Some have been known to live as long as 32 years. Okay, what do porcupine tracks look like? Well, they're characterized by 4 toes on the front foot, 5 on the back. And that plus their waddling gait and marks that are left by their tail leave very characteristic track pattern. So it would look something like this down here. So you can see different feet here. Here's a tail mark, and it's going back and forth. They're basically waddling. So let's watch this porcupine walk. It's a very waddling gait, and from the way he walks, you can picture what the track would look like. So there he goes, very waddling, side to side. See the tail hitting the ground. So you can easily picture what a track would look like. Okay, so this is what it would look like in the sand. So again, 4 toes on the front foot, 5 on the back. Notice back here you can see a little imprint that's left in the sand from the tail. And here it is in the snow. Once again, if you look really closely here, you can see the track that's left by the tail. So porcupines actually don't like deep snow because they have very short legs. So here's porcupine scat. Often when we're out in the woods, we can tell who left the scat by where they left it. And it's unmistakable when we see porcupine scat because they often leave large amounts of scat right outside the entrance of one of their dens. So this obviously is showing a den in a hollow tree, and you can see all the scat on the ground. So once the snow starts in winter, the porcupines often just come out just outside the den, they defecate and then go back in the den. And that often leads to these very large piles of scat. Uh, Porcupine damage to trees is often on the branches that are up very high. So here you can see marks that the porcupine has stripped away the bark on this tree way up high. But they may eat the bark on any of the branches or on the trunk. And they just chew down to the cambium, and they leave some very shallow marker grooves where their incisors scrape up against the wood. And this is showing basically that. So again, this was left by a porcupine. And this shows very extensive damage that was caused. This bottom of this tree is almost totally denuded by the porcupine. Okay, porcupines live in dens, and their dens are often in a cave, a rock crevice, or a hollow tree. And they're usually solitary. They usually only live one to a den. But given the right circumstances, multiple porcupines may occupy a site. Actually, in Allegheny State Park in Western New York, near where I grew up, multiple porcupines actually took over an old abandoned sawmill building, and they were feasting on the treated wood that was still inside that abandoned sawmill. And sometimes as many as a dozen porcupines might share an uninsulated den in the wintertime. Porcupines don't hibernate in winter, but they usually stay in their dens if it's very cold or stormy weather. And because they have those very short legs, they can't navigate very well in the deep snow. So this is showing a den. This happens to be a rocky crevice, but they might also live in a cave or a hollow tree. And you might see a few quills outside the den. You can, if you look real close, you can see a few quills. You're actually more likely to see signs of what they eat. So either some hemlock twigs or some popped open acorns. Once again, this is showing a den in a hollow tree, and it's got these huge piles of scat outside. And we couldn't get this video to embed into this PowerPoint presentation, but we'd encourage you to click on that link and watch the video. It basically highlights a typical porcupine den and a porcupine climbing up a tree. So it shows how well they can climb that tree. It also shows the waddling gait of the porcupine, and it shows the huge pile of scat at the base of the tree. And nearby is its favorite, the eastern hemlock. So if you get a chance, go ahead and click on that link and watch that video. Okay, porcupines are active all winter long. They often stay in their dens when it's real cold or stormy. But because they have those very short legs, they can't navigate very well in the deep snow. They'll often eat apples and acorns to store up energy in preparation for winter. But in winter, they eat mostly bark and branches, and those are of fairly limited nutritional value. As a result, they may lose up to a third of their weight during the winter. So again, this is showing porcupine in winter. They don't hibernate. They usually stay in their dens, but they look for the eastern hemlock twigs in winter. Here's some hemlocks back here. This porcupine is going out there to get some of those twigs. And these short legs, we'll watch, make it very difficult for them to walk in the snow. So there he's munching on a twig. But look at him kind of lumber along in the snow. Very short legs, makes it very hard for him to walk in the snow. Okay, porcupines. What are the predators of the porcupine? Well, they can be preyed upon by wolves, bears, cougars, bobcats, lynx, coyotes, wolverines, eagles, and big owls. But those predators usually learn the hard way that they're not going to be very successful. The primary predator of the porcupine is actually the fisher. And most of those other predators would attack the porcupine either from above or behind, and they readily get thwarted by those sharp quills. But the porcupine has two vulnerable spots, its face and its belly. And the fisher knows exactly how to attack those two spots. So again, because they're the main predator, we often see the fisher and porcupine populations inversely related. So if you don't have very many fishers, you may have a lot of porcupines. On the other hand, if you have lots of fishers, you'll have very few porcupines. So when confronting a predator, the porcupines usually duck their heads and have their quills facing back toward the predator. They actually spin around multiple times to keep their back facing that predator. I'll show you a video of that in a minute. But the fishers are very good. They actually outmaneuver them. The fisher will repeatedly circle the porcupine, attacking its head and its face to disorient it or disable it, and then it turns the porcupine over, and then it attacks the belly of the porcupine. And sometimes they'll also force a porcupine to fall out of a tree. So remember, the porcupine climbs up the tree, gets out on those skinny little branches, and if the fisher kind of comes out after him, the porcupine may actually fall down onto the ground. And the ecological significance of this predatory pattern between the fisher and the porcupine is important. If you didn't have any fishers, you might have an overpopulation of porcupines. The porcupines then might overbrowse some of the tender new growth, and they might chew away a lot of the bark on trees, actually harming the trees and leading to a decline in the forest health overall. So again, when they're confronted, the porcupines spin around. So let's watch this video. So look how the porcupine spins. And that spinning is what they do to avoid getting attacked by the fisher. So again, we're going to see what the fisher does. We've got to watch this very quickly. Okay, so the fisher attacks the head and the face of the porcupine, and once the porcupine is disabled, they attack its belly. And this photo actually shows the skull of a porcupine that was killed by a fisher, and you can see that the fisher actually crushed the skull of that porcupine, and then was able to attack its belly. This is just showing some signs that were found in the woods. This is courtesy of northern woodlands, showing the remains of a porcupine in the snow. A fisher obviously got a hold of that porcupine. Okay, porcupines rely heavily on hemlock forests. So this is one of the other dangers to the porcupine. As the hemlock woolly adelgid threatens our hemlocks here in New England, this important food source for the porcupines will become in jeopardy. I also mentioned the other thing that happen to porcupines is that they often go out too far on a limb and end up falling out of the tree. Some autopsy studies on porcupines have actually shown that probably over a third of them have actually evidence of old fractures that are due to falling out of trees. And again, the porcupine's worst enemy is the automobile. Okay, as we mentioned before, because they crave salt, they often come to the side of highways to feed on that road salt and then get hit by the automobiles. So that's why we probably most often see porcupines as roadkill rather than seeing them out in the live. And this is just showing one of those porcupines that's getting a little bit too far out there. Remember, he may weigh close to 35 pounds, and he could easily fall out of that tree. And once again, they often get multiple fractures from those falls from trees. Ouch, that dog got quilled. So if your dog gets quilled, you should seek medical attention immediately if you or your dog gets quilled. And that's because the quills absorb water and body heat, and they'll expand, and that helps them work their way deeper into the skin. And I showed you the microscopic barbs that will further damage the skin if you just try to pull them straight out. The skin can become infected. And some have recommended to snip the ends of the hollow quills to relieve some of the pressure inside, but that actually may make it more difficult to remove them totally, and that's no longer recommended. And though some say you could remove the quills from yourself or a dog yourself, we recommend you see a medical professional for yourself and a veterinarian for your dog. Proper cleaning after removal is important. And some may use a topical antibiotic, but it's very interesting that porcupine quills actually apparently have some intrinsic antibiotic properties. So again, how do you get rid of a nuisance porcupine? We're sometimes asked how to get rid of one. If the porcupine is destroying trees on your property or simply close to your pets. There are cage-like traps that can be used to capture and relocate them, but you need to know the regulations in your state, and you should also consider that relocation is not always the humane thing to do. And because porcupines are classified as wildlife, here in New Hampshire, you do need a specific license to trap them. Uh, and there are strict rules on what you can do with them after you capture them. So we'll show you basically how the traps work, but we recommend you always consult a licensed professional. A, so you don't get quilled yourself in the process. B, so that you don't injure the porcupine. And C, because the professional should know where he's going to be able to relocate that porcupine. So this is showing a typical trap that would be used to capture a porcupine. These cage-like traps have been used to capture many animals, including porcupines. And because porcupines crave salt, the type of bait you would use typically would be something like a sliced apple that's coated with salt. Some people have also used carrots or turnips or pumpkin that's mixed in with some cooking oil and salt to use as bait. And you could also probably use a hemlock twig, which again is one of their favorite foods, or a piece of wood that's coated with salt. And basically, what you do is that this part would not be down; it would be up. You would put a little bit of bait at the front of the cage, and then you'd put a lot more bait back here. So hopefully, the porcupine would come in, get this first bit of bait, and then see the bait back in the back of the cage, and the cage door would drop, and he would be trapped. So again, what good are porcupines? You might be asking yourself this question. They do impact the ecology in some good ways as well as bad. Again, as we mentioned before, they're an important part of the food chain, particularly if you're looking at it from the perspective of the fisher. And they also, their foraging behavior does transport some food and nutrients from the tree canopies to the forest floor, either by way of the dropped branches or the large volume of scat that they leave. And some people say we should think of them as tree pruners. Well, I don't know about that. We think about them as a mystery species. So that's a bit about porcupines, what I like to call the mystery mammal. And hopefully you learned a little bit about them.